Welcome to a Foreign Policy Quickie with Bear Afkhami. Today's question is, what interest does the U.S. have in the Persian Gulf? Why are we asking this question? What we're trying to ascertain is a good answer on whether the U.S. should leave the Persian Gulf and expend its resources elsewhere in the world that could be more beneficial to the United States. Our strategic considerations, as in many other foreign policy decisions, are impacts on regional, that is, Middle Eastern, or global stability, the impacts on American national security, the impacts on American competitiveness regionally and around the world, and of course, the impacts on American influence. Number one answer, it's not going to surprise anyone, is of course access to oil. Historically, the United States has depended heavily on Middle Eastern oil, and Middle Eastern oil flows out of the Persian Gulf. Of course, this need for Middle East oil has declined. In a 2018 survey, 15% of Persian Gulf oil was going to the United States, while the overwhelming majority, 80% of Gulf oil, was going to Asia. And of course, here's a list of some of the top um, importers of Persian Gulf oil: China at 19%, India, Japan, and South Korea at 13%. So this brings up a very interesting question. Of course, while we are not receiving the majority of oil that goes to Asia, should the United States have a hand in being able to deny our adversaries access to oil? Now, that creates certain advantages and, of course, disadvantages. One disadvantage mainly being that we are expending resources, but it is a strategic consideration, being able to deny resources to your adversary. It does give you an extra, let's say, card up your sleeve. Freedom of navigation as number two. Of course, the Persian Gulf um, does serve as the import-export hub of oil and gas. However, import and export of other products are also served by the Persian Gulf. We do export products to Persian Gulf nations, and they also export certain products to other nations that we may want to, or our allies might need to have access to. And the freedom of navigation really comes into play because the U.S. naval presence in the Persian Gulf provides that security that's required for freedom of navigation. So if the Fifth Fleet were to leave the Persian Gulf, other forces, such as nation states, non-nation state actors, and of course, even pirates, could cause quite a lot of disruption in the Persian Gulf. Now, do we care that much about that if we're not getting much oil? Even though we're only getting 15% or so oil from the Persian Gulf countries, um, disruptions in those shipping lanes could still cause negative global impacts, which would eventually, because we're a globalized world, impact the United States. Basically, any instability tends to be a negative thing. Number three, preventing terrorism. This comes directly for national security. And a good foreign policy concept typically is it's good to have a seat at the table because it gives the nation state a voice. And the voice is really something that lends itself to power and influence. So, success of military operations involve logistics, intelligence, and launch points close to targets. What we're talking about is a new terrorist group forms, let's say ISIS, and instead of having to deploy major vessels or create new alliances or get permissions from different airports of our foreign allies and sometimes even adversaries, we already have the logistics bases, the intelligence points, and other launch points for missiles or aircraft close to those targets. So we don't have to spend as much money bringing those up to the location where we need them to launch. And Outside of military actions, the success of diplomatic actions also involve on-the-ground understanding and interaction with impacted parties. So if our diplomats are not already on the ground, having a hand in conversations, understanding the culture, understanding the history, then we could be creating a situation where we're going to be um, unsuccessful in preventing or fighting terrorism. Number four, of course, standing by our allies. In the region, Israel and some Arab Gulf states are considered to be our allies. Some relationships are more fractured than others. However, if the United States, the Fifth Fleet, and its large military and diplomatic presence were to leave the Persian Gulf, there is a very big question of whether these American allies would be able to withstand forces from Iran. Of course, Iran, a big regional power, and wants to become a bigger regional power. And one of the main reasons it hasn't is because of the American presence in the Persian Gulf. And really, what we're considering is, would the scales be tipped if the United States were already all of a sudden removed from this Persian Gulf region? What actors would try to take over? And as far as actors trying to take over or filling a power vacuum, of course, we have to consider the actions of global adversaries such as Russia and China. Russia has already proposed that there would be new Gulf Cooperation Councils, security councils that include the Gulf Arab states, that include Iraq, that include Iran, but do not include the United States. So Russia is already setting foundations for being able to take advantage of a U.S. strategic withdrawal from the Persian Gulf. Of course, China, given that 19% of its oil comes from the Persian Gulf, has a very large strategic interest in the Persian Gulf. So they may attempt to fill that power vacuum as well. Of course, regional adversaries, as we mentioned, such as Iran, may become more emboldened if there is no U.S. presence to provide a counterbalance, and that may tip the scale against our allies. Thank you very much for watching. And of course, please subscribe to be notified of any upcoming videos. Feel free to leave a comment if you have anything to say, any questions, whether you agree or disagree with these assessments on what interests the U.S. has in the Persian Gulf. Thank you.